Most people do not fail because they are weak. They fail because they spend years moving in the wrong direction without realizing it. And the dangerous part is that the wrong path rarely feels wrong in the beginning. It feels familiar, comfortable, reasonable. Life keeps moving, routines keep repeating, distractions keep filling the silence, and slowly a person loses connection with who they were meant to become. Not through one catastrophic decision, but through small unconscious choices repeated long enough that they begin to feel normal. That is how people drift away from themselves, quietly, almost invisibly. The Stoics understood this with unusual clarity. They believed the greatest danger was not pain or failure, but unconscious living, becoming controlled by comfort, emotion, approval, and distraction while convincing yourself you are still free. Marcus Aurelius wrote that a person's life is shaped by the thoughts they return to most often, and that should make more people stop and reflect. Because when the mind becomes consumed by fear, comparison, avoidance, and noise, the direction of life begins changing with it. By the time many people finally pause long enough to look honestly at where they are heading, years have already disappeared. What makes this even more unsettling is how easily the mind adapts. A habit repeated long enough no longer feels like a choice. It begins to feel like identity. People learn to tolerate exhaustion. They learn to tolerate emptiness. They learn to live disconnected from themselves while calling it responsibility, patience, or stability. But there is a difference between enduring something meaningful and slowly abandoning yourself. One builds strength. The other slowly destroys it while pretending to keep you safe. People often mistake exhaustion for achievement because modern life rewards visible movement more than meaningful direction. Someone can stay busy all day and still feel disconnected from their own life. The mind keeps moving, but internally nothing feels grounded. That kind of exhaustion is different. It feels heavier because the work is disconnected from purpose. Over time, people stop asking themselves what truly matters and start measuring their worth through productivity, approval, and external validation. The Stoics believed that once a person loses internal direction, they become vulnerable to every external influence around them. Approval starts shaping decisions more than wisdom. Fear becomes louder than judgment. Comparison slowly replaces clarity. And because these influences exist everywhere, people rarely notice how deeply they affect their choices. A person sees the lifestyle others praise and begins chasing it without asking whether it actually aligns with their nature. Another sacrifices peace in order to maintain an image that earns admiration. Someone else abandons a meaningful path because it no longer receives external validation. These shifts happen gradually until reaction becomes automatic. At that point, life no longer feels intentional. It feels managed by pressure coming from every direction except within. Human beings naturally seek acceptance because rejection feels threatening. Yet modern life has amplified that instinct to an unhealthy degree. People now shape entire identities around being accepted by audiences that constantly change their expectations. One moment, honesty is praised. The next moment, conformity is rewarded instead. Trying to satisfy unstable standards creates permanent tension because the target never stops moving. A person begins editing themselves carefully, hiding opinions, suppressing instincts, and adjusting behavior depending on the environment they enter. Eventually, they become skilled at performing versions of themselves that receive approval while losing connection to who they actually are beneath those performances. This is where inner conflict begins quietly. The mind senses the gap between authentic conviction and socially acceptable behavior, even when nobody else notices it. That tension creates a strange form of loneliness because a person can be surrounded by validation while still feeling unseen. Deep down, they understand the acceptance they receive is attached to a role they have learned to maintain. The Stoics warned about this kind of dependence because anything controlled by outside opinion remains unstable by nature. Epictetus taught that freedom begins when a person stops attaching their peace to things outside their control. Reputation, praise, status, approval. All of it can disappear quickly because it depends on the emotional reactions of other people. Many spend years trying to avoid disappointing others while quietly disappointing themselves every day. They stay silent when honesty would create tension. They continue relationships that drain them because leaving would upset expectations. They choose security over meaning because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. At first, these compromises appear small enough to justify. Over time, they begin shaping character. Someone who repeatedly ignores their own judgment eventually stops trusting themselves altogether. That loss of self-trust changes the way a person moves through life. Decisions become slower. Confidence weakens. Resentment quietly grows beneath the surface because the mind recognizes when it is betraying its own convictions. Real strength begins developing when a person becomes willing to disappoint the crowd in order to remain honest with themselves. Not cold, not arrogant, just honest. A disciplined mind pays attention to feedback without becoming enslaved by it. Someone who cannot tolerate disagreement becomes easy to manipulate because fear of rejection will control their behavior more effectively than reason ever could. But a person grounded in their own values moves differently. They stop seeking permission to become who they already know they need to be. And although that path can feel isolating at first, it creates a deeper form of peace than approval ever will. Once a person begins paying closer attention to their inner life, they also begin seeing other people differently, not with bitterness, not with suspicion toward everyone around them. The shift is quieter than that. It becomes an awareness of how strongly human behavior is shaped by pressure, desire, fear, insecurity, and self-interest. Stoicism never encouraged hatred toward humanity. It encouraged clarity about it. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself that people act according to what they believe is good in the moment, even when their actions create harm. That understanding creates a calmer kind of awareness. You stop expecting perfection from people while also becoming more careful about who you allow close to your mind and your future. Many people assume that because they are honest, others will naturally respond with honesty. Because they are loyal, loyalty will automatically return to them. But life rarely operates according to fairness alone. Human beings are complicated. Their words often reflect who they want to believe they are, while their actions reveal who they become under pressure. That difference matters more than most people realize. Someone can speak with warmth during comfortable moments and still disappear the second difficulty appears. Another person can promise support while secretly prioritizing their own advantage the moment circumstances change. This does not make humanity evil. It makes humanity human. The problem begins when people ignore these patterns because they are emotionally attached to the version of someone they hoped existed. Real character becomes visible during uncomfortable situations. Pressure removes performance. When convenience disappears, priorities reveal themselves naturally. A person who values honesty only when honesty costs nothing has not truly developed integrity. Someone who remains loyal only while circumstances are easy has not built real loyalty. Seneca warned often about the influence of companionship because he understood how deeply people absorb the emotional habits of those around them. The people closest to you shape your standards slowly and almost invisibly. Their mindset enters your thinking through repetition. Their fears begin influencing your decisions. Their excuses become easier to justify because you hear them often enough that they start sounding reasonable. Human beings adapt to social environments more quickly than they realize. That is why the wrong relationships rarely destroy someone immediately. The damage develops gradually through normalization. Spend enough time around constant negativity and eventually pessimism begins feeling intelligent. Spend enough time around emotionally reactive people and calmness starts feeling unnatural. Spend enough time around individuals who avoid accountability, and excuses become easier to accept inside yourself as well. The mind absorbs what surrounds it repeatedly. Even ambition can weaken when constantly exposed to people who quietly resent discipline or growth. Over time, someone who once had clear direction can slowly lower their standards without noticing when it happened. Not because they consciously chose to abandon themselves, but because the environment around them slowly reshaped what felt acceptable. This is why solitude became so important within Stoic philosophy. Not permanent isolation, but intentional distance from influences that distort judgment. A person who never steps away from noise eventually loses the ability to hear their own reasoning clearly. Constant emotional exposure affects perception. If every conversation around you revolves around gossip, comparison, resentment, or distraction, your mind eventually begins operating within those same patterns. The danger is subtle because emotional environments do not announce their influence loudly. They shape behavior through repetition. Someone begins tolerating habits they once questioned, then defending them, then participating in them. By the time awareness returns, entire years may have been spent adapting to standards they never consciously chose. If these reflections are helping you think more clearly about your own life, consider subscribing and continuing this journey toward greater awareness. A calmer mind sees what distraction tries to hide. People often mistake exhaustion for achievement because modern life rewards visible movement more than meaningful direction. Someone can wake up early, stay busy all day, answer messages constantly, carry endless responsibilities, and still feel an emptiness they cannot fully explain. The mind keeps moving, but internally nothing feels grounded. That kind of exhaustion is different from the fatigue that follows meaningful effort. It feels heavier because the work is disconnected from purpose. A person begins carrying obligations without understanding why they accepted them in the first place. Over time, they stop asking whether their daily actions still reflect their deeper values and start measuring their worth through productivity alone. That is why so many people appear functional on the outside while quietly feeling detached from their own lives. The Stoics believed that once a person loses internal direction, they become vulnerable to every external influence surrounding them. Approval starts shaping decisions more than wisdom. Fear becomes louder than judgment. Comparison slowly replaces clarity. And because these influences are everywhere, people rarely notice how deeply they are affecting their choices. A person sees the lifestyle others praise and begins chasing it without questioning whether it truly aligns with their nature. Another sacrifices peace in order to maintain an image that earns admiration. Someone else abandons a meaningful path because it no longer receives external validation. None of these shifts happen instantly. They develop gradually through repetition until reaction becomes automatic. At that point, life no longer feels intentional. It feels managed by pressure coming from every direction except within. There is a reason people become trapped inside routines that no longer fulfill them. Human beings naturally seek acceptance because rejection feels threatening. The desire to belong is deeply connected to survival, which is why social approval carries so much emotional power. Yet modern life has amplified that instinct to an unhealthy degree. People now shape entire identities around being accepted by audiences that constantly change their expectations. One moment, honesty is praised. The next moment, conformity is rewarded instead. Trying to satisfy unstable standards creates permanent tension because the target never stops moving. A person begins editing themselves carefully, hiding opinions, suppressing instincts, and adjusting behavior depending on the environment they enter. Eventually, they become skilled at performing versions of themselves that receive approval while losing connection to who they actually are beneath those performances. This is where inner conflict quietly begins. The mind senses the gap between authentic conviction and socially acceptable behavior even when nobody else notices it. That tension creates a strange form of loneliness, because a person can be surrounded by validation while still feeling unseen. Deep down, they understand the acceptance they receive is attached to a role they have learned to maintain. The Stoics warned about this kind of dependence because anything controlled by outside opinion remains unstable by nature. Reputation, approval, praise, status, and popularity can disappear quickly because they depend on the emotional reactions of other people. Building your identity on those reactions creates a fragile foundation that constantly needs reinforcement. Many people spend years trying to avoid disappointing others while quietly disappointing themselves every day. They stay silent when honesty would create tension. They continue relationships that drain them because leaving would upset expectations. They choose security over meaning because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. At first, these compromises appear small enough to justify. Over time, they begin shaping character. Someone who repeatedly ignores their own judgment eventually stops trusting themselves altogether. That loss of self-trust changes the way a person moves through life. Decisions become slower. Confidence weakens. Resentment quietly grows beneath the surface because the mind recognizes when it is betraying its own convictions. Still, many continue down the same path because standing alone feels frightening after spending so much time depending on acceptance for emotional stability. Real strength begins developing when a person becomes willing to disappoint the crowd in order to remain honest with themselves. That does not mean becoming cold, arrogant, or emotionally distant. It means learning how to listen carefully to your own reasoning instead of constantly adjusting yourself to avoid criticism. The Stoics understood that external noise becomes dangerous when it is allowed to overpower inner clarity. A disciplined mind pays attention to feedback without becoming enslaved by it. That balance matters. Someone who cannot tolerate disagreement becomes easy to manipulate because fear of rejection will control their behavior more effectively than reason ever could. But a person grounded in their own values moves differently. They stop seeking permission to become who they already know they need to be. And although that path can feel isolating at first, it creates a deeper form of peace than approval ever will. That peace does not arrive through sudden transformation. It develops slowly through repeated acts of honesty. A person begins saying what they truly think. They stop apologizing for boundaries that protect their well-being. They spend more time examining their motives and less time chasing validation from people who do not carry responsibility for their future. Gradually, the mind becomes quieter because it is no longer divided between authenticity and performance. There is less internal negotiation, less exhaustion from trying to maintain an image, and in that quiet space something returns: self-respect, not the confidence built on praise, but the steadier kind that comes from knowing your life is moving in alignment with your own understanding rather than the expectations of strangers. Many people assume that because they are honest, others will naturally respond with honesty. Because they are loyal, loyalty will automatically return to them. But life rarely operates according to fairness alone. Human beings are complicated. Their words often reflect who they want to believe they are, while their actions reveal who they become under pressure. That difference matters more than most people realize. Someone can speak with warmth during comfortable moments and still disappear the second difficulty appears. Another person can promise support while secretly prioritizing their own advantage the moment circumstances change. This does not make humanity evil. It makes humanity human. The problem begins when people ignore these patterns because they are emotionally attached to the version of someone they hoped existed. That is why the wrong relationships rarely destroy someone immediately. The damage develops gradually through normalization. A person spends enough time around constant negativity and eventually pessimism begins feeling intelligent. Spend enough time around emotionally reactive people and calmness starts feeling unnatural. Spend enough time around individuals who avoid accountability and excuses become easier to accept inside yourself as well. The mind absorbs what surrounds it repeatedly. Even ambition can weaken when constantly exposed to people who quietly resent discipline or growth. Over time, someone who once had clear direction can slowly lower their standards without noticing when it happened. Not because they consciously chose to abandon themselves, but because the environment around them slowly reshaped what felt acceptable. This is one of the reasons solitude became so important within Stoic philosophy. Not permanent isolation, but intentional distance from influences that distort judgment. A person who never steps away from noise eventually loses the ability to hear their own reasoning clearly. Constant emotional exposure affects perception. If every conversation around you revolves around gossip, comparison, resentment, or distraction, your mind eventually begins operating within those same patterns. The danger is subtle because emotional environments do not announce their influence loudly. They shape behavior quietly through repetition. Someone begins tolerating habits they once questioned, then defending them, then participating in them. By the time awareness returns, entire years may have been spent adapting to standards they never consciously chose. A disciplined person learns to observe others carefully without becoming consumed by judgment. That balance matters. Cynicism poisons the mind just as much as naivete does. Stoicism teaches awareness without hatred. You recognize human weakness while also recognizing your own capacity for it. That humility changes the way you move through relationships. Instead of blindly trusting words, you begin paying attention to consistency. Instead of becoming attached to appearances, you observe behavior across time. How someone acts when frustrated, how they speak about people who are absent, how they respond when there is nothing to gain from kindness. These details reveal more than dramatic declarations ever could, because behavior repeated consistently forms character. The longer someone ignores the influence of their environment, the harder it becomes to separate their authentic self from the habits they absorbed unconsciously. Eventually, people stop realizing how much they are being shaped by the emotional atmosphere around them. Their reactions become automatic. Their standards weaken gradually. Their thinking becomes less intentional. At that point, they are no longer directing their environment carefully. The environment is directing them. And once a person reaches that stage, reclaiming clarity requires more than motivation. It requires distance, reflection, honesty, and the willingness to choose influences that strengthen the mind instead of quietly exhausting it over time. The Stoics paid close attention to this because they understood how unstable human perception becomes during emotional extremes. They did not teach people to suppress feelings or become emotionally numb. That misunderstanding has distorted Stoicism for years. The goal was never to eliminate emotion. The goal was to prevent emotion from gaining complete authority over action. A disciplined mind still feels anger, fear, grief, excitement, and disappointment. The difference is that it does not immediately obey them. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself to step back from emotional reactions and examine them before acting because he knew emotions speak loudly, but not always truthfully. A feeling can be real without being accurate. That distinction changes everything once a person begins practicing it consistently. Many regrets are born from moments that lasted only minutes. A conversation handled impulsively. A relationship entered because loneliness became emotionally unbearable. An opportunity abandoned because fear temporarily felt stronger than courage. At the time, those decisions often feel reasonable because emotion alters perspective from the inside. Anger convinces a person they must respond immediately or lose control. Fear convinces them danger is larger than it truly is. Excitement convinces them caution is unnecessary because everything suddenly feels certain. The emotional state compresses time until the present moment appears more important than every future consequence connected to it. That is why people later look back on certain decisions and struggle to recognize the version of themselves who made them. This is why the pause matters so much. Not because pausing makes someone passive, but because pausing creates separation between feeling and action. That separation allows judgment to return. A person who can pause before reacting develops a kind of stability that most people never fully build. They stop becoming prisoners of every emotional wave passing through them. Instead of reacting automatically, they begin observing what they are feeling first. The feeling still exists. The anger still burns. The fear still tightens the chest. The excitement still pulls attention forward. But there is now enough awareness present to prevent emotion from immediately deciding what happens next. In that small space between impulse and action, clarity begins returning. Modern life constantly weakens this ability because everything encourages immediate reaction. Instant opinions, instant responses, instant emotional expression. People are rewarded for reacting quickly rather than thoughtfully. Over time, this conditions the mind to treat every feeling as urgent. Someone becomes upset and immediately sends the message. They feel anxious and immediately retreat. They feel excitement and immediately commit without reflection. The nervous system becomes trained for reaction instead of observation. That pattern slowly damages judgment because a reactive mind cannot think clearly for very long. It remains controlled by whatever emotional state is strongest in the moment. The Stoics understood that real freedom begins internally. A person ruled entirely by emotional impulse may appear independent on the outside, while remaining deeply controlled on the inside. Every frustration shifts their mood. Every disappointment disrupts their peace. Every emotional trigger changes their behavior. That instability becomes exhausting over time because the mind never fully rests. It stays trapped in cycles of reaction, constantly pulled in different directions by temporary states. Discipline interrupts that cycle. Not harsh discipline rooted in self-punishment, but quieter discipline rooted in awareness. The kind that teaches a person to sit with discomfort without immediately obeying it. There is strength in learning not to trust every feeling automatically. That does not mean becoming cold or detached from emotion completely. It means understanding that emotions provide information, not commands. Fear may reveal uncertainty worth examining, but it should not always determine direction. Anger may reveal violated boundaries, but it should not always choose the response. Excitement may reveal passion, but it should not remove careful judgment. Once a person understands this, emotional experiences stop feeling like emergencies that require immediate action. They become signals to observe carefully before moving forward. A calmer mind sees consequences more clearly because it is no longer trapped inside temporary emotional storms. That clarity protects the future in ways many people only understand after painful mistakes. One disciplined pause can prevent years of regret. One moment of restraint can preserve relationships, opportunities, reputations, and peace of mind. That is why emotional control is not weakness. It is protection. Not protection from life itself, but protection from becoming destructive to your own future during moments when you temporarily lose sight of who you truly are. People often believe their greatest obstacle will arrive in the form of hardship. They prepare themselves for failure, rejection, loss, criticism, uncertainty. Yet many lives are not quietly diminished by pain. They are diminished by comfort. Not the healthy kind of comfort that allows rest and recovery, but the kind that slowly removes urgency from a person's life until growth no longer feels necessary. That is what makes comfort so deceptive. Pain immediately demands attention. Difficulty forces adaptation. Hard seasons reveal weaknesses that must be confronted. Comfort rarely does that. It allows a person to remain exactly where they are, while convincing them they are safe simply because nothing feels immediately wrong. The Stoics understood that human beings become weaker when they stop exposing themselves to challenge voluntarily. That is why many of them practiced small forms of discomfort intentionally. Cold temperatures, simplicity, periods of restraint. Not because suffering itself was virtuous, but because they knew comfort weakens awareness over time. A person who becomes too attached to ease starts organizing their entire life around avoiding discomfort. Once that pattern develops, growth becomes threatening because growth almost always requires uncertainty. The mind begins choosing familiarity over possibility. It prefers what is predictable, even when what is predictable is slowly reducing the quality of life itself. This process rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. Someone remains in the same environment year after year because leaving would require disruption. Another continues repeating routines that no longer bring meaning because the routines still feel emotionally manageable. A person tells themselves they will change eventually, but eventually becomes another month, another year, another decade. The frightening part is how easy it becomes to adapt to stagnation once repetition takes over. Human beings normalize their conditions quickly. Even dissatisfaction can become familiar enough to tolerate. Once that happens, people stop recognizing how much of their potential has gone unused, because the absence of growth begins feeling ordinary. There is a difference between peace and stagnation, though many confuse the two. Peace contains clarity, energy, presence. Even during quiet moments, there is still movement internally. A person at peace continues evolving because they remain connected to purpose and awareness. Stagnation feels different beneath the surface. It carries heaviness, emotional dullness. Days begin blending together without leaving much behind, except repetition. Yet stagnation often disguises itself as stability because nothing appears chaotic externally. Bills are paid, responsibilities are handled, life continues moving in familiar patterns, but internally something begins fading slowly. Curiosity weakens, ambition softens, the mind stops reaching toward growth because comfort has trained it to seek maintenance instead of expansion. That is why routines must be examined carefully. Routine itself is not the enemy. Disciplined structure can strengthen the mind and protect attention from chaos. But routines repeated unconsciously become dangerous. A person can become so accustomed to their patterns that they stop questioning whether those patterns still serve the life they are trying to build. Days become automatic. Decisions become automatic. Even emotional reactions become automatic. The mind enters a state where it no longer observes carefully because familiarity creates the illusion that observation is unnecessary. That unconscious repetition slowly disconnects people from themselves because awareness cannot survive long where reflection disappears completely. Many environments appear safe while quietly reducing a person's capacity for growth. A comfortable job may protect someone from financial uncertainty while draining all sense of meaning from their work. A familiar relationship may protect against loneliness while slowly weakening emotional well-being. Certain habits may reduce anxiety temporarily while creating deeper long-term problems that remain hidden at first. Comfort often works this way. It offers immediate emotional relief while collecting a slower cost beneath the surface. And because the cost arrives gradually, people rarely notice what is happening until years have already disappeared. The mind naturally avoids uncertainty because uncertainty feels emotionally exposed. That is why many people remain attached to situations they already know are limiting them. The current discomfort feels manageable because it is familiar. Change introduces unknown outcomes, and unknown outcomes trigger fear. Yet growth has always required movement beyond psychological familiarity. The Stoics believed resilience develops through exposure to challenge, not avoidance of it. A person who constantly protects themselves from discomfort eventually becomes fragile because they lose confidence in their ability to adapt. Then even small disruptions begin feeling overwhelming because the mind has become too dependent on predictable conditions. This dependence creates a subtle form of captivity. Life begins revolving around maintaining comfort instead of pursuing meaning. Decisions are made based on what feels safest emotionally rather than what strengthens character or creates long-term fulfillment. Over time, people become more afraid of temporary discomfort than permanent regret. That reversal changes the direction of an entire life. Instead of asking whether something is meaningful, they ask whether it is easy to maintain. Instead of asking whether an environment helps them grow, they ask whether it protects them from stress. Slowly, the desire for emotional safety becomes stronger than the desire for transformation. The way a person thinks about consequences quietly determines the direction of their entire life. Most people do not notice this because they focus almost entirely on immediate emotional experience. They ask themselves what feels easier, safer, more comfortable, or more pleasurable right now. The present moment becomes the center of every decision. Yet the Stoics understood that a meaningful life cannot be built through short-term emotional thinking alone. Every action carries a future attached to it. Every repeated habit shapes the condition of the mind over time. Every avoidance creates consequences, just as every disciplined choice does. Once a person begins seeing decisions this way, life stops feeling random. Patterns become visible. Causes become visible. The connection between daily behavior and long-term peace becomes impossible to ignore. Most suffering arrives long before people recognize the decisions that created it. Someone avoids difficult conversations because silence feels easier in the moment. Months later, resentment has quietly damaged the relationship beyond repair. Another person continually escapes responsibility because comfort feels more attractive than effort. Years later, they feel weak, directionless, and frustrated without fully understanding why. The consequences did not arrive immediately, which is exactly what made the behavior dangerous. Human beings naturally underestimate slow damage. If pain appeared instantly after every destructive choice, many people would change far sooner. But life often works gradually. The emotional reward comes first. The consequence arrives later. By then, the habit has already become deeply rooted. This is why temporary feelings can be so deceptive. The mind treats emotional relief as proof that a decision was correct, even when that relief is quietly producing long-term instability. Distraction feels pleasant because it removes discomfort temporarily. Avoidance feels peaceful because it delays tension temporarily. Impulsive pleasure feels satisfying because it provides immediate stimulation. But temporary emotional relief is not the same thing as lasting peace. The Stoics constantly reminded themselves of this because they understood how easily the mind becomes controlled by short-term impulses when awareness weakens. A person who follows every emotional urge eventually loses the ability to direct their life intentionally. They become reactive instead of deliberate. The future is shaped through repetition far more than dramatic moments. A single decision rarely changes everything overnight. The pattern behind the decision does. Someone who repeatedly chooses distraction over focus slowly weakens their attention span. Someone who repeatedly chooses comfort over discipline gradually loses resilience. Someone who repeatedly avoids difficult truths eventually becomes disconnected from reality itself because denial starts feeling safer than honesty. These shifts happen quietly. That is why people often feel confused by the condition of their lives years later. They search for one major cause while ignoring the hundreds of smaller choices that slowly created their current situation. The Stoics trained themselves to think beyond emotional immediacy because they knew the mind becomes vulnerable when trapped inside the present feeling alone. A person controlled entirely by immediate reaction becomes predictable because their behavior is always determined by temporary discomfort or desire. Fear pushes them backward. Anger pushes them forward recklessly. pleasure distracts them sideways. Their direction changes constantly because their inner state changes constantly. That instability creates weakness because the mind never develops consistency. Someone capable of thinking long-term moves differently. They become less controlled by temporary emotional weather because they are no longer asking only what feels good right now. They begin asking where a decision leads if repeated consistently over time. That question changes behavior at a deeper level. Suddenly, small actions matter more because their future consequences become visible. 1 hour of distraction no longer feels insignificant when multiplied across years. 1 moment of dishonesty no longer feels harmless when recognized as part of a growing pattern. 1 act of discipline no longer feels small when understood as reinforcement of character. Awareness transforms ordinary decisions into turning points because it reconnects the present moment to the future it is creating. There is a quieter kind of strength that develops when someone stops organizing life around immediate comfort. They begin tolerating necessary discomfort because they understand the long-term value connected to it. Difficult conversations become easier to face. Responsibilities stop feeling like punishment and start feeling like investment. Delayed gratification becomes meaningful because the person recognizes what it protects and builds internally. This does not make life emotionless. It creates stability within emotion. A person still feels fear, boredom, frustration, and desire, but those feelings stop controlling every decision automatically. That shift changes the entire relationship between thought and action. Eventually, a person realizes that peace is not something discovered accidentally at the end of life. It is built gradually through repeated decisions that either strengthen clarity or weaken it. Every action either trains the mind toward greater stability or deeper dependency on impulse. Every repeated behavior shapes future character. And once someone fully understands that their daily choices are quietly constructing the emotional condition of their future, they stop treating small decisions casually. They begin living with greater intention because they finally recognize that the life waiting ahead is being created now, one repeated choice at a time. One of the most difficult things a person can do is admit that a direction they committed to is no longer leading where they hoped it would. Not because the truth is impossible to see, but because the ego resists correction once identity becomes attached to a decision. People continue investing energy into careers that quietly drain them, relationships that repeatedly diminish them, habits that slowly weaken them, simply because walking away feels like admitting failure. The mind starts measuring worth through consistency alone, even when that consistency is producing suffering. Yet remaining loyal to a harmful path does not transform it into the right one. Time already invested cannot justify more years spent moving further away from peace. The Stoics understood that wisdom required flexibility, not emotional instability or constant indecision, but the ability to adjust once reality became clear. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself to follow truth rather than pride, because pride protects identity, while truth protects life itself. That distinction matters more than many people realize. Pride tells someone to continue defending a mistake because admitting error feels humiliating. Wisdom asks whether continuing the mistake will create even greater damage over time. One response protects the ego temporarily, the other protects the future. And although the ego speaks loudly, it rarely speaks with genuine concern for long-term well-being. Its primary goal is self-preservation, even when preservation comes at the cost of growth. This is why people sometimes remain trapped in situations they internally know are wrong. A person may recognize the relationship is no longer healthy, yet continue holding on because they fear starting over. Someone may understand their environment is limiting them, yet remain because familiarity feels emotionally safer than uncertainty. Another may sense they abandoned important parts of themselves years ago, yet continue repeating the same patterns because confronting reality would require difficult change. The awareness exists quietly beneath the surface, but the mind keeps distracting itself from it. It searches for reasons to delay action because delay feels easier than disruption. Still, avoiding truth does not erase it. The cost simply grows more slowly and silently over time. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from defending what the mind already knows is misaligned. A person begins carrying emotional tension constantly because part of them is trying to move forward while another part is resisting necessary change. They rationalize, they minimize, they search for temporary distractions. But internally, the conflict remains unresolved because awareness does not disappear once it has been recognized. This is why self-honesty becomes so important. Without it, people spend years performing certainty while quietly feeling disconnected from their own direction. The longer this continues, the harder it becomes to separate genuine conviction from fear disguised as commitment. The ego often confuses persistence with strength, but persistence only becomes meaningful when the direction itself remains aligned with reality. Continuing blindly towards something destructive is not discipline, it is attachment. The Stoics believed strength required the humility to examine whether your actions still reflected reason rather than emotional stubbornness. A person walking in the wrong direction does not become wiser by refusing to turn around. They simply travel further away from where they intended to go. Yet pride can make even obvious corrections feel threatening because the ego interprets change as damage to identity. It would rather continue suffering consistently than risk appearing uncertain for a moment. Many people wait too long to adjust because they hope clarity will eventually arrive without requiring discomfort. But clarity often deepens through action, not avoidance. The moment someone begins confronting reality honestly, confusion starts weakening. They stop wasting energy protecting illusions and begin directing attention toward what can actually be changed. This process is rarely dramatic. Real transformation usually begins quietly. A person finally admits they are unhappy. They stop pretending a harmful pattern is temporary. They recognize that certain behaviors, environments, or relationships are no longer strengthening their life. That recognition may feel uncomfortable initially, but discomfort connected to truth carries a different quality than discomfort connected to denial. One leads toward freedom, the other leads toward prolonged stagnation. There is also a quieter form of courage involved in changing direction without turning the process into self-hatred. Many people become trapped between denial and shame. Either they refuse to acknowledge mistakes completely, or they collapse into guilt once awareness arrives. Stoicism rejected both extremes. The goal was never emotional punishment. It was clear observation followed by deliberate adjustment. A calm mind can acknowledge error without destroying itself emotionally over it. That balance creates resilience because the person remains focused on correction rather than becoming consumed by regret. Regret only becomes useful when it produces awareness strong enough to create change. Otherwise, it becomes another form of emotional paralysis. Life constantly changes whether people accept it or not. Relationships evolve, priorities shift, circumstances transform. The mind itself changes over time through experience and reflection. Someone who refuses to adapt eventually becomes trapped inside outdated versions of themselves because they are too attached to who they used to be. Flexibility grounded in awareness allows growth to continue. Not chaotic reinvention, but thoughtful adjustment based on reality rather than ego. A disciplined person understands that changing course when necessary is not weakness. Sometimes it is the clearest evidence that awareness is still alive. And perhaps some part of you already recognizes where honesty is needed most. Not loudly, quietly. There may be a pattern you continue defending even though it no longer serves you. a decision you keep postponing because certainty has not arrived yet, a truth you feel internally every time the distractions fade and the mind becomes still for a moment. If that awareness exists, do not ignore it. Most people spend years avoiding the very clarity that could change their lives because facing it requires temporary discomfort. Yet awareness is rare, and once it appears clearly enough, life begins offering a choice. Continue protecting the familiar path, or begin moving towards something more honest before more time disappears, repeating what already no longer feels right. The wrong path rarely looks dangerous while you are walking it. That is why awareness matters so much. A single moment of honesty can change the direction of an entire life, long before regret has the chance to settle in permanently. Keep choosing clarity over comfort. Keep choosing discipline over impulse. And keep paying attention to the quiet truths most people spend years trying to avoid. If this message stayed with you, watch one of the videos on the screen right now. Continue strengthening the mind before the world convinces you to live unconsciously again. Thank you for being a part of Stoic Life and for committing to growth, reflection and mastery. This video is made for educational and entertainment purposes only. Topics may include Stoicism, self-improvement, dating psychology, relationship advice, breakup recovery, emotional intelligence, self-respect, masculine mindset, and personal growth. Some content may contain AI-generated voice, script, visuals, or editing assistance. Our goal is never to mislead or spread false information. The content is intended to inspire confidence, emotional control, mental strength, healthier relationships, and positive self-development. Please use your own judgment and seek professional advice when needed.